Some background information before I start. I'm a 23-year-old female, and I live in a very rural part of Tennessee, at the base of the Cumberland Plateau in the Appalachian Mountain Range. It's so remote that I can't even get internet hooked up at my house. I have to use mobile data if I want to access the internet. Despite how remote it is, I do really enjoy living so far out in the country, and I expect that I always will. My boyfriend and I have two very protective dogs, Roxy and Cracker Jack. We also have grown up around firearms and know how to use them. We genuinely felt safe being alone in our isolated house. We have a 2.5-acre property, and our closest neighbor is over 3 acres away, so no one has any reason to bother us and come on our land uninvited. This happened to me back in late November. I was enjoying my night off from work as a caregiver, while my boyfriend was working late and would not be home until 2 or 3 in the morning. This didn't bother me, as I've stayed overnight at my house plenty of times alone in the past 2 years. I decided to go to bed early and wake myself up in a few hours when my boyfriend got home, so I would be awake to greet him. I climbed into bed with both of my dogs and fell asleep. Around 1:30 in the morning, my bigger dog, Roxy, started growling deeply at the bedroom window and woke me up. I tried to get her to hush, fairly certain there was a coyote or something roaming around our yard, but she suddenly started barking extremely loud. I hear something crash and fall outside against the bushes by my bedroom window. Roxy bolted to my bedroom door and started scratching it, still going crazy and barking while trying to get out. I quickly get up out of bed with my other dog, grabbed my loaded revolver from under my bedside table, and opened my bedroom door. Roxy sprints to the front door and starts clawing at it, like she's going to break it down. I paused and thought for a second before opening it. If it really was just an animal out there, I didn't want my dogs loose to sprint after it into the darkness and possibly never be seen again. I decided to look out the window that was beside my front door and get a sense of what I was dealing with. What I saw more than shocked me. It honestly scared me. There was a man wearing jean shorts and a white tank top running away from the house, heading towards the road. I didn't know if I should release the dogs to chase him or call my boyfriend or the police. After a moment, I decided to call the local sheriff's department. I explained to the dispatch lady what had happened, making sure to mention to her what the trespasser had been wearing. The dispatch told me that they would send a deputy out to my area immediately. She asked me if I wanted to have them come by my house so that I could make a report. I said that I did. After I got off the phone with the dispatch, I called my boyfriend and told him everything. He immediately said that he was leaving work and coming home. When he got home, he took a flashlight and the dogs and started looking all around the outside of the house for any traces of the intruder. He didn't find anything, except for the damaged bushes underneath our window. We waited for nearly 2 hours for the deputies to arrive, but they never showed up. I didn't receive a follow-up call of any kind either. In the days that followed after the incident, my boyfriend came to the conclusion that it must have been one of our shady neighbors that lived a couple of miles up the road from our house. That may very well be true, but what bothered me the most was of all the places the stranger may have tried to enter the house, he chose to try to get into my bedroom window, where I was sleeping. If he was just looking to rob us, why hadn't he tried to enter through the front door, or the garage or back porch? And also, all my neighbors know that we have dogs, and it seems like this intruder wasn't aware of that. I may just be paranoid and jumping to conclusions, but I don't think this guy was interested in robbing us. I think he may have been up to something much worse. I have a coworker named Paul who was in the Navy back in the 1970s upon the USS Shreveport. We got to talking one day about the perils of being at sea and how in some instances the weather can be the least of your concerns. Paul explained while being stationed on the transport ship, the crew used to be paid in cash every other week, which I found strange as they couldn't exactly go anywhere to spend their money and food was provided. He told me that the sailors would predominantly use their earnings to gamble, and playing cards was the usual method. There were a few individuals on board who acted as loan sharks, and during the week in between payments, would loan out cash with high interest rates. Paul worked as a cook in the mess hall. He was acquainted with another man in his division. We'll call this man Jack. Jack was constantly behind on his debts to the loan sharks. Keep in mind, there was no place on board the ship where the loan sharking sailors couldn't find you. And it's not as though you could seek help from the officers. Jack finally fell so deep into debt, he wasn't going to be able to repay what he owed. And once back on land, the debts were nullified. But the men he owed money to weren't about to let his balance go unforgiven. Every day aboard the ship, the crew would be lined up for roll call. One morning, Jack wasn't in his designated spot. He would never stand there again. The entire ship was searched, but no trace of him was ever found. It's only speculation, but Paul believes that Jack met a grisly end and was thrown overboard. What better place to dispose of a body than over the side of a Navy vessel at night? An investigation was conducted. The crew was questioned, but no proof of foul play was ever uncovered. It was concluded that one way or another, he ended up in the water, and it was ruled an accident. The problem with that theory is that aboard every ship, regardless of the weather or time of day, there's a watchman stationed at the stern of the ship, keeping an eye on things, watching for anyone who's fallen overboard and calling for help. For that poor soul in the water, that vigilant sailor, is their one and only chance for rescue. And if they fail to spot you, you're as good as dead. It's entirely possible that the watchman did not see Jack as he floundered in the waves, but the far more likely scenario was that he was already bound and unconscious or dead before even hitting the water. It makes you wonder how many countless bodies have been tossed overboard, claimed by the sea, and forgotten by history. Let me start off by saying that I'm 5'2", 130 pounds, former military. I may be a little bit on the small side, but I don't scare easy. I got hired by a security company working the graveyard shift. I had a specific routine I had to do. Points to hit with a magnetized wand. Keys to unlock doors and gates at specific times. Nothing that I couldn't handle. I was already a bit of an insomniac, and driving helped to clear my mind, so the job was almost ideal. After training on a new route for a few days, I was ready to hit it on my own. This specific route took me to the edge of the city, where the warehouses met the country. There was no traffic, and very few light posts. Even the cell service was a bit sketchy. I didn't understand why, but the guy that trained me was part Native American, and didn't care much for the route. I soon understood why. The company cars we drove were hybrids, which were very helpful because I didn't have to stop for gas at all during my route. My night started off normal. I picked up my keys from dispatch, checked the vehicle, and hit most of my points on schedule. I had my work phone and my personal phone in the cup holders of the vehicle, and my giant flashlight on my hip. I made my way to the outskirts of town to hit my next checkpoints. I exited the highway and didn't notice anything unusual. No traffic, no people. The area was dimly lit and quiet as usual. I pulled around the warehouse to the side gate where my checkpoint was. That's when I noticed a dark figure standing under the light post a few yards away. Strange, but not a crime. So I continued to make my way forward. The figure simply disappeared into the mist. Now I'm spooked. I froze. I didn't want to get out of my vehicle, but I didn't want to lose my job either. I talked myself into getting as close as I could to the gate without actually getting out of my car, hitting the checkpoint quick, and getting the hell out of Dodge. I tried convincing myself that I hadn't seen what I thought I had, and the figure simply walked away through the darkness. But just as I approached the light post, my damn car turned off. It was like the battery shorted out. There was no lights. It didn't turn over. And soon after, the light post shortened out as well. There was no way in hell I was getting out of my car. I tried to call dispatch on my work phone, but it was dead. Next, I tried calling my coworker from my personal phone. There was only static. In a panic, I tried hitting the steering wheel, and the car turned back on. I floored it all the way to the highway, nearly forgetting to turn the headlights back on. I didn't go back to that checkpoint all night. When I was questioned about it from my boss, I explained what happened, and he simply said, "No one told you?" Apparently everyone knew something weird went on at that warehouse, and no one had bothered to tell me, either convinced that they were individually crazy, or because they thought I wouldn't believe them. I pleaded to be put on another route, but was softly denied. Before I reached the area the next time I was on patrol, I requested my supervisor to meet me at the checkpoint should my vehicle malfunction again. He informed me that he would be a few minutes behind me. Slightly satisfied, I exited the highway. It was a typical quiet scene, but I was on edge. I felt my paranoia kicking in. I turned the corner to the checkpoint, and the road was empty. I took a quick look around and got back in the vehicle, but as soon as I closed my door, I saw a woman in a pink dress standing in the middle of the street. Slightly creeped out, I closed my door and tried to get a good look at her before calling dispatch. She had long black hair covering her face and was carrying a beat-up summer hat with a red ribbon around it. The woman staggered in a mechanical way to the side of the road opposite the warehouse, leaving me enough room to pass. I decided to chance it rather than wait for her to approach me. I floored it, and the vehicle slows to a halt a few feet past the woman. "What the hell?" I scream, beyond frustrated, punching the steering wheel, calling my supervisor only to receive no answer. In my rearview mirror, I see the woman walking towards me, and then suddenly disappear. I freaked out and started frantically turning the key, but it still wouldn't start. The woman suddenly appeared at the passenger window. She then screamed like she was a banshee on fire. She then banged her bony fists against the window. I was trapped in a useless sardine can of a car, with no way to defend myself or call for help. All I could do was keep trying to turn the ignition. The woman continued beating on my window and screaming about how she can see me. She hit the window again, and it cracked. I considered making a run for it, but before I could decide, I saw headlights. Another vehicle with their high beams on rounded the corner and raced towards me. The woman vanished, but the crack on my window remained. I turned my key again, and the engine kicked into life. The car that came from around the warehouse turned out to be my supervisor. He then called me up and instructed me to follow him to the nearest gas station so he could check out the damage that was done to the car. Once we got there, he found a few scratch marks down the side of my vehicle, like something had crawled its way up from under it. There were dents in the passenger door like someone had kicked it with a boot, and of course there was the crack in the window. There was no plausible explanation for the damage. We reviewed the security footage from the warehouse and saw my vehicle drive up to the checkpoint in perfect condition. As I began to drive away, the footage went fuzzy. It was only when my supervisor arrived on scene that the security footage resumed. That was more than enough for me. I resigned from my position and decided the day shift was the place to be. My hometown hit the national news on April 16th to April 23rd, 2017. The Facebook killer was found at a local McDonald's and was chased towards the downtown area where he eventually shot himself. This story is about my very close encounter with that man. I'm a 25-year-old female. It all started on Sunday, April 17th. It started out as a normal day. I woke up around 3:30 p.m. as I worked the night shift at a local fast food restaurant, and I'm not due into work until around 5 p.m. Work continued as normal until my boss got a text from his roommate saying that there was this guy that shot an old man and filmed it on Facebook Live. Because we had been here all night, we hadn't heard of it yet, and there were reports of him being seen in our city at a store that was near the restaurant. Although these reports were unverified, and the police said that there was no reason for them to believe that he was here for sure. My boss dismissed it as social media frenzy and misinformation, although he did make sure to double-check our lobby doors to make sure that they were indeed closed and locked. The rest of the night went like any other Sunday night. I woke up again around 3:30 a.m., and hopped onto social media trying to see if they found the Facebook killer. To my dismay, he was still at large. But luckily, there were reports that he was spotted in Philadelphia. I was relieved and decided that I would walk home that night. My shift went by slowly, but smoothly. At around 2 a.m. I got out of work and decided that I was going to stop by a 24-hour store that was nearby. I picked up some groceries and was done around 2:45. As I was walking home, I see a man in a white Ford Fusion. I was extremely paranoid at this point, so I dove into some bushes hoping and praying that he didn't see me. The car ended up pulling into another fast food restaurant, but without stopping the car, he turned around and pulled away. I continued to sit in the bushes until his headlights were out of sight. I then booked it home and went straight to bed. The next morning I woke up and found out that the Facebook killer was seen in my city driving, you guessed it, a white Ford Fusion. He had been spotted the previous night about 500 yards away from where I work. While I was in the bushes the previous night, I had seen him shortly before the police chase started that eventually ended in him taking his own life. I understand that this story may not seem very scary, but to me, it could have meant my life had he seen me. He stated on a Facebook Live video that he was going to kill as many people as he could before the police caught him. In retrospect, I probably should have called the police as soon as I saw that car. But obviously, I wasn't 100% sure it was him at the time. I'm still pretty on edge about it, and I feel very sorry for that poor man that he killed. This man was severely mentally ill, and he should have got the help that he so desperately needed before going off the deep end. I come from a small town in central Kentucky. There wasn't a whole lot to do there on weekends, and even less to do when I was a teenager living there over 20 years ago. There was a few tourists that came through the area because the original home of Abraham Lincoln is there, a few miles outside of town. The neighboring counties have well-known bourbon distilleries that have tours available during the day. The two major cities in the state were about an hour away. However, for the youth, there isn't much in the way of entertainment. There wasn't a movie theater or even a Walmart in my county. It's a small farming community where you know over half of the people by name and recognize the other half because you've seen them so many times and just haven't been introduced. On the weekends, if there wasn't a home football game on Friday night, you would just ride around in a 2.5-mile loop and stop at one of the 3 spots where the local youth would congregate. If there was nothing going on in town, we would just take to the country roads and just drive around with no real destination in mind. There were usually a few beers involved, but nothing that would put one in danger. On one such evening, there was a few of us on the road that we had all driven down hundreds of times, when something happened that I will never forget. The road in question is somewhat of an attraction, as it's where a site called the Donkey Tree can be found. The Donkey Tree is a regular tree except one of the lower branches is unusual, and that it bears a remarkable resemblance to a donkey's head. The mouth, nose, eyes, and even ears, which are 2 branches splitting off the top of the head, are all distinguishable. As we passed the Donkey Tree, the air changed. It felt like the temperature dropped suddenly. It's not unheard of for that type of temperature change to take place when a thunderstorm is approaching. The intersection of warm, humid air and cool, dry air make for one hell of an atmospheric spectacle. However, this temperature change was different. The sky was clear, and the stars were shining bright. As peculiar as it wasn't something that caused me major alarm. I kept driving in the same direction, and just a bit down the road, we encountered the smell of decomposing flesh. This isn't a very uncommon thing, considering when you grow up in the country, there is always roadkill that stinks until nature can clean up the carcass. There's also the possibility that a head of a livestock had died in the past couple of days, and the farmer who had owned the animal hasn't had the chance to dispose of it properly. It was the strongest decomp smell that I had ever experienced. It was as if it was in the car with us. I sped up the car to try to leave the putrid smell behind us as quickly as possible. After getting a couple hundred feet down the road, I thought I noticed something in the rearview mirror. It was at that point that I saw something that I can only describe as a human head. Only, there wasn't a body. It was only a head that was floating, or chasing us in midair. It was right outside the back window of the car. There are several curves before reaching the end of the road, and every curve I took, the face was right behind us. I couldn't shake it. The eyes were as black as night, and it wore a grin that made my blood freeze. Then, it morphed into a demon head, red face, horns, enlarged canine teeth, but it still had those dark eyes. It changed into more terrifying faces, but by that time it was so much of a blur that I can't even remember them all. It must also be noted that this took place on a short stretch of road, and the time that elapsed was less than a minute from start to finish. My friend in the passenger seat noticed the terrified look on my face and looked back. The look on his face let me know that I wasn't the only one seeing whatever it was that was following us. Through all the stammering that he produced, only one word was audible. "Go." It wasn't even a yell. It was barely a whisper. I didn't need to be told twice, or even once as it turned out, because I put the pedal to the floor, and that poor car had the hardest half mile it ever experienced that evening. I should have wrecked on a couple of those curves, but as I neared the end of the road, the floating head stopped on a dime and quickly disappeared into the night behind my taillights. I can't explain why it suddenly stopped its pursuit of me and my friend, but as it did, the temperature returned to normal and the smell was gone, and there was a peacefulness about being there. Later, when I asked my friend about what he saw, he described something completely different from what I remember seeing. Maybe the devil appears to everyone in different forms, even if witnessed at the same time. I don't know about that. I have since moved from that small town in central Kentucky, and I don't often reminisce about the cruising we did as teenagers. However, I still occasionally think about that evening, and even after all these years, it still gives me the chills. This happened to me last spring. I live in a quiet part of northern London and attend a very academic all-girls school in my neighborhood. Since my school is extremely prestigious, we were required to complete the Bronze Duke of Edinburgh program as part of the school curriculum. When our first ever expedition for Duke of Edinburgh was coming up, we all felt pretty confident about it. But since we were a useless bunch of teenagers, our teachers thought that it would be helpful for us to practice setting up. I didn't like the sound of that at all. It was just so utterly creepy to stay in school overnight on some tiny playing field at the far corner of the campus. The most disturbing part about that field was that it faced an abandoned building. Even though it was separated by a stone wall, it still looked creepy. It was one of the only abandoned houses in the neighborhood, and the fact that it was such an oddity made the situation even worse. We came to school in the evening to practice setting up the tents, and it was kind of weird seeing the school without any students in it. It seemed so much bigger. I was in the same tent as my best friend Kate, because she was assigned to my group for the expedition. As I expected, I was not able to fall asleep easily in the tent, so I just kept going through my phone until it was late, and I was sure that everyone was asleep, including Kate. I started to drift off around 2 a.m., but then it started to rain, and it was in that moment that I understood that I should have been listening to the teacher's explanation of how to correctly put up a tent, because it slowly started to fill up with water. I imagined that we probably hadn't zipped up the outer layer of the tent properly, so I gathered every bit of strength that I had and climbed outside, leaving my phone. I struggled for a while but ended up successfully zipping up the tent. By the time I had finished, I was soaking wet, so I decided to grab a dry hoodie from my PE kit. I made my way over to our PE department, which had been left open in case we needed to use the bathrooms. The halls were pitch black, so I was really creeped out. I went to the changing room, turned on the light, and changed into my dry hoodie. When I pushed down the door handle to leave, for some reason I found that it was stuck and wouldn't budge. It felt as if someone was holding the handle on the other side. So being my 14-year-old self, I asked quietly, "Hello?" No response. I then asked in a very firm and clear voice, sounding braver than I felt, Is there anybody there? Again. There was no response. I started wiggling the door handle so hard that it came off in my hand. At this point, the lights went out in the changing room. The situation seemed as though it was straight out of a horror film. But reality was catching up to me as I understood that somebody really was on the other side of the door, because the light switch in the changing rooms was outside. I was about to have a panic attack, so without thinking, I started banging on the door and kicking while screaming "help" at the top of my lungs, desperately hoping that a teacher or a security guard would hear me. I think it only angered the person, as I saw part of the door which the handle was screwed onto slowly begin to turn. I immediately ran to the other side of the changing room and locked myself in one of the shower stalls, which was really the only place that made sense to hide. As soon as I locked the stall behind me, I heard the door opening and heavy footsteps entering the room. I suspected that it was a man. I tried to silence my breathing with my hand, but I don't think I did a very good job, as the footsteps soon stopped right outside my shower stall. At first, I couldn't quite comprehend what he might be doing, but then I saw an eye glaring at me through one of the gaps between the door hinges. That was the most scared I had ever been in my life. I screamed like there was no tomorrow. I swung the door open as hard as I could, smashing the man in the face. I ran out of the changing room and down the hallway while screaming so loudly, my own ears began to ring. The building was about 20 meters away from the playing field, but I remember as clear as day while I was running away, I turned around and saw a figure in a dark hoodie, so I ran as fast as I could while screaming at the top of my lungs, which woke up most of the people that were sleeping in the tents. I had a panic attack and couldn't breathe correctly for about 10 minutes. I later explained to the teachers what happened. They called the police, but the man was never found, probably because I had given him plenty of time to escape. Everyone was sent straight home after that. I suspect whoever he was, he had been watching us from the abandoned building across the way. That night still haunts me to this day.
There's always a reason to be afraid.